The sharp, biting wind howled as the team of climbers reached Everest Base Camp. Towering peaks loomed in every direction, piercing the sky with jagged summits, while the vast, snow-covered terrain stretched endlessly before them. They had made it to over 17,000 feet, higher than any of them had been before, and the sheer altitude was already taking its toll. Every breath was labored, their lungs burning with the effort to pull oxygen from the thin air. Faces were flushed from both the cold and exhaustion, but there was a palpable sense of determination among the group. They had come this far, and they wouldn't turn back now. Mark, the team's leader, scanned the surroundings. His weathered face, framed by a thick beard streaked with gray, bore the marks of countless expeditions, but even he seemed tense. Everest was not just any mountain. It was a place that demanded respect, and he knew the risks. "Take it easy," Mark called out, his voice hoarse from the dry air. "We'll rest here for the night, acclimate, and push on tomorrow." The climbers, a diverse group from different walks of life, began setting up camp. Some moved sluggishly, affected by altitude sickness, while others managed to keep up a steady pace, driven by adrenaline and excitement. Tents popped up like little patches of color against the stark white of the snow. In the distance, the towering peak of Everest seemed to watch them silently, a cold and indifferent guardian. Among the group was Julia, a young woman in her late 20s, her face flushed but eyes wide with the thrill of the climb. This was her first time attempting something this monumental, and though her body ached, she felt a surge of pride as she sat down to rest. She had trained for this for years, and now she was here on the slopes of Everest, closer to the sky than she had ever imagined. "Not bad, huh?" Sam, one of the other climbers, said as he dropped his gear next to Julia. He was tall and lean, his skin bronzed from years of outdoor adventures. He grinned, pulling off his gloves and flexing his fingers. "Feels like we're on another planet." Julia nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Yeah, it's incredible. It's like nothing else exists up here." As the group settled into their camp, a heavy silence descended over the landscape. The wind, ever present, gusted through the tents, flapping the fabric like ghostly whispers. The cold was brutal, biting through layers of gear, but none of them complained. They were too focused on what lay ahead, on conquering the mountain. But then, something changed. It started with a faint sound carried on the wind, something unfamiliar. Julia, sitting outside her tent, furrowed her brow, straining to hear. It wasn't the howling of the wind or the usual creaking of the ice underfoot. It was softer, almost like voices, but distant, indistinct. She stood, looking around, but saw nothing. The other climbers seemed preoccupied, some resting in their tents, others adjusting their equipment. Then she saw it. Far off, along the side of the mountain, a small group of figures was moving. They were hard to make out at first, dark silhouettes against the bright snow. But as they approached, it became clear who, or rather what, they were. "Guys," Julia called softly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Do you see that?" Sam stood up next to her, squinting into the distance. "What the hell?" The rest of the team soon gathered, drawn by the strange sight. A group of monks, 5 or 6 of them, were walking along the sheer slope of the mountain, heading toward an unseen destination. They wore nothing but simple, dark robes. No protective gear, no boots, just bare feet trudging through the snow. Their heads were bowed, and they moved in perfect harmony, as if each step had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Despite the brutal cold, they seemed unaffected, gliding effortlessly along the path as though they were part of the mountain itself. "What the? Are they barefoot?" asked Ben, one of the older climbers, his voice thick with disbelief. "They can't be real," Sam muttered. "No one survives out here without gear, not at this altitude." Julia's eyes were wide with shock. The wind had picked up, and though she could barely hear anything else over the howling gusts, she could just make out a faint sound, chanting. The monks were chanting something, though the words were impossible to understand, swallowed by the wind before they reached the climber's ears. Mark stepped forward, his expression hard to read. "I've seen them before," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. The others turned to look at him. "You've seen this before?" Julia asked, her voice shaking slightly. "These monks?" Mark nodded, his gaze never leaving the distant figures. "A few years back, on a different climb. They walk like that, barefoot, without gear. I tried to follow them once. Thought maybe they were heading to some hidden village or a camp." He paused, his face grim. "I lost them. No matter how fast I climbed, no matter how hard I pushed, they always stayed just out of reach. And then they were gone." The wind howled again, louder this time, as if the mountain itself had heard Mark's words and was warning them. "What do you think they're doing?" Julia asked, her breath coming in clouds. Before Mark could answer, the group's porter, an older Sherpa named Dorj, spoke up. He had been silent until now, his eyes fixed on the monks. "They are heading to Shangri-La." The climbers turned to him, confused. "Shangri-La?" Ben asked, his tone incredulous. "You mean the mythical paradise?" Dorj nodded slowly. "It is said that those monks are on a pilgrimage, a sacred journey to a place hidden from the rest of the world. A place where the harshness of the mountain does not touch." The wind picked up again, a cold, stinging reminder of where they were. The monks, now distant figures, continued their silent march, disappearing slowly into the white expanse. The team exchanged glances, the strange encounter settling into their minds like an icy weight. None of them spoke, but the question lingered. Was Shangri-La real? And if it was, would they ever see it? As the last of the monks vanished into the blinding snow, the team knew one thing for certain. This mountain was far more than they had bargained for. The night settled in quickly at base camp, the temperature plummeting as darkness overtook the towering mountains. The cold was absolute, biting at any exposed skin and creeping into the thickest layers of clothing. Inside their tents, the climbers huddled close to their sleeping bags, grateful for any warmth they could find. The memory of the monks, walking barefoot in the snow, still lingered in their minds. Julia lay on her back, staring up at the thin fabric of her tent. She could hear the wind battering against the walls outside, but her mind was far away. Back on the mountain's edge, watching those mysterious figures vanish into the storm. The sight of them haunted her, a mixture of awe and disbelief. How could they have survived in such conditions? And what were they chanting? Unable to sleep, she unzipped her tent and stepped outside into the freezing night. The camp was quiet, save for the faint sound of wind and the occasional muffled voices from other climbers. The stars above were impossibly bright, scattered across the black sky like diamonds, and the silhouette of Everest loomed against the horizon, a shadow that seemed alive in the moonlight. She wasn't alone for long. Sam joined her, a thick wool hat pulled down over his ears, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, shuffling closer to the small campfire that was still burning. Julia shook her head. "Not after that. I can't stop thinking about those monks." Sam exhaled deeply, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah, I've been trying to figure that out too. It doesn't make any sense. No one survives at this altitude like that. No shoes, no gear, nothing." They stood in silence for a moment, staring into the flickering flames. The warmth of the fire was a fleeting comfort in the otherwise brutal cold. As they stood there, the rest of the team slowly emerged from their tents, drawn by the same unease that had kept Julia awake. Soon, they were all gathered around the fire, bundled up against the cold, but too restless to sleep. "I've been up and down Everest for years," Mark said quietly, breaking the silence. "But those monks, they're something else. Every time I've seen them, it's the same. They walk like that, silently, chanting something you can't make out. I've never gotten close enough to understand it. And believe me, I tried. Where do they go? Julia asked, her voice low, as if speaking louder would disturb the stillness of the night. Mark shook his head. That's the thing. They don't seem to go anywhere. They just disappear. The fire crackled as the team absorbed Mark's words. Ben, the older climber with a seasoned face and eyes that had seen too much, leaned forward, staring intently at Mark. You really think there's something more to them? Like something supernatural? Sam scoffed. Supernatural? Come on, it's gotta be some trick of the light or maybe… Before he could finish, Dorj, the veteran Sherpa who had been quietly sitting by the fire, raised his hand. The climbers fell silent, all eyes turning to the old porter. His face, weathered by years of life in the mountains, was calm but serious. They are not an illusion, Dorj said softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the skeptical Sam. Those monks are real, and they are on a sacred journey. A pilgrimage. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Julia shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. A pilgrimage to where? She asked. Dorj's gaze drifted to the mountains, his dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of the fire. Shangri-La. The name sent a ripple of intrigue through the group. Shangri-La. The legendary paradise hidden deep within the Himalayas, a place of eternal peace and untouched beauty. A place that most considered nothing more than a myth. You're talking about Shangri-La? Ben asked, incredulous. That's just a story, a legend. Dorj nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. Yes, a story. But stories are often born from truth. My people have passed down tales of the monks for generations. It is said that they are the guardians of Shangri-La, and that they make their journey across the mountain to return there, where no others may follow. Julia listened intently, her heart beating faster. But Shangri-La doesn't actually exist, right? I mean, it's just a metaphor for a lost utopia, isn't it? Dorj smiled, though it was a small, enigmatic smile. There are many things on this mountain that cannot be explained by reason alone. Just because you have not seen something does not mean it is not real. Sam crossed his arms, skepticism written across his face. So, what? You're saying that if we follow these monks, they'll lead us to some hidden paradise? A city of gold in the middle of the snow? Dorj's eyes were fixed on the distant peaks. I am saying that Shangri-La is not a place you find by searching for it. Only those chosen by the mountain can enter. And those who try to follow the monks, they do not return. A heavy silence settled over the group. The idea of Shangri-La, of a hidden paradise somewhere in these deadly mountains, was almost too much to grasp. But the way Dorj spoke with such conviction made it difficult to dismiss entirely. Julia's mind raced with questions. Could the monks really be leading them to such a place? Was it possible that the mountain held secrets beyond their understanding? And if Shangri-La did exist, what would happen if they found it? The fire crackled again, snapping her out of her thoughts. Mark stood up, brushing the snow off his pants. All right, enough ghost stories for one night. We've got a big climb ahead of us. Rest up. Reluctantly, the others began to retreat to their tents, though none of them felt at ease. Julia lingered by the fire for a moment longer, watching the stars and the dark outline of the mountain. Shangri-La, she thought. Could it really be out there? As she finally returned to her tent and zipped it closed, the distant, soft sound of chanting echoed in her ears. It was almost as if the mountain itself was calling out, waiting for them to answer. The morning sun rose reluctantly over the towering peaks, casting a pale light over Everest Base Camp. The cold still clung to everything, seeping through layers of gear and chilling the climbers to their bones. Despite the sunshine, the mountain remained an imposing silhouette against the sky, as if it knew the humans below were preparing to challenge it. Julia awoke to the muffled sounds of gear being packed and tents being unzipped. The previous night's conversation about the monks and Shangri-La still lingered in her mind, but she pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the climb ahead. Today, they would begin their ascent to higher camps, inching closer to the summit of Everest, the ultimate goal that had driven them all to this place. She emerged from her tent to find the team already gearing up. Mark, their seasoned leader, was checking ropes and oxygen supplies, his face focused and unreadable. His years of experience on these mountains were clear in every movement, a stark contrast to the anxious energy that seemed to buzz among the rest of the group. "Everyone ready?" Mark asked, his voice a little too calm for the tension in the air. The team nodded, though there was a quiet unease hanging over them. Julia adjusted her harness and glanced up at the mountain. The path ahead was steep and treacherous, the kind of terrain that demanded absolute focus. There was no room for hesitation or doubt here. The mountain would not forgive mistakes. As they started the climb, the sounds of base camp faded behind them, swallowed by the vast expanse of ice and rock. The air grew thinner with every step, each breath a conscious effort as they ascended into the unforgiving heights. The landscape was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional gust of wind whipping through the cliffs. Sam, climbing just ahead of Julia, turned back with a grin. "Not bad for the first stretch, huh?" Julia forced a smile. "Yeah, not bad." In truth, the altitude was already beginning to weigh on her. The thin air made her head throb, and her limbs felt heavier with each passing hour. She pushed through the discomfort, focusing on the rhythm of her steps, the rope in front of her, the steady beat of her own breath. This was what they had trained for. Months of preparation for this exact moment. But as the climb wore on, Julia couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The mountain felt different. The vast icy expanse around them seemed too still, too quiet. The wind, once a constant companion, had died down, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The weight of the previous night's stories of monks and mythical places pressed on her mind. After several hours of climbing, they reached a narrow ridge that offered a view of the valley below. The team stopped for a brief rest, drinking water and catching their breath. Julia leaned against a rock, her heart pounding in her chest as she took in the view. It was beautiful in a way that defied description. Vast, endless whiteness stretching out beneath them, broken only by the sharp ridges of the surrounding peaks. "I've never seen anything like it," Julia murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Easy to forget how dangerous it is when it looks like this, huh?" Sam said, joining her at the edge of the ridge. Julia nodded. "Yeah, you almost want to believe it's peaceful." Sam chuckled, though it was a dry sound. "Don't let it fool you. This place'll kill you without a second thought." Julia was about to respond when something caught her eye. A flicker of movement far below, near the edge of the valley. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the cliffs. But as she squinted, the shapes became clearer. Figures, moving along the mountain. The monks. There they were again, walking in the same steady rhythm, their dark robes stark against the snow. Barefoot, heads bowed, they moved as if the freezing conditions didn't affect them in the slightest. And though the climbers were hundreds of feet above, Julia could almost swear she could hear the faint echo of chanting on the wind. "Mark," Julia called out, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It's them, the monks. They're back." The team gathered near the edge, squinting down at the valley below. Sure enough, the monks moved silently across the snow, undisturbed by the harsh conditions. "They must have been walking all night," Ben muttered, his face etched with confusion. "How are they still going?" Mark said nothing, his gaze fixed on the distant figures. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Julia thought she saw a flicker of unease cross his usually calm features. "We stick to the plan," Mark said finally, his voice gruff. We keep moving. But as the team prepared to continue the climb, the unease only deepened. There was something about the way the monks moved, something that felt wrong, unnatural. Julia couldn't put her finger on it, but the sight of them sent a shiver down her spine. The higher they climbed, the more frequent the glimpses of the monks became, always distant, always just out of reach. No matter how high they ascended, the monks seemed to keep pace, their presence a constant, haunting reminder of the strange forces at play on the mountain. "They're not real," Sam muttered at one point, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "They can't be. It's just altitude sickness messing with our heads." But even as he spoke, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the monks were leading them somewhere, guiding them towards something they couldn't yet understand. Hours passed, the climb growing steeper and more treacherous. The wind returned, bitter and sharp, cutting through their layers of clothing. The exhaustion was beginning to wear on everyone, their breaths coming in labored gasps as they pushed through the thin air. But the mountain was relentless, demanding more with every step. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the peaks, Mark called for a stop. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "We'll set off early tomorrow." The team set up camp on a narrow ledge, the drop on either side a reminder of just how precarious their position was. Julia helped secure the tents, her fingers numb from the cold, her mind still turning over the strange events of the day. As night fell and the team gathered around a small portable stove for warmth, the conversation turned once again to the monks. "They're leading us somewhere," Ben said, his voice low. "I don't know where, but they're not just wandering the mountain." "Maybe it's Shangri-La," Sam said with a half-hearted laugh. "Maybe we're about to stumble into paradise." George, who had been quiet most of the day, finally spoke. "If they are leading you, it is not to paradise." The words hung heavy in the cold night air. No one responded, but Julia could see the tension in everyone's faces. What had once seemed like a myth, a distant story about monks and hidden paradises, was now becoming something far more real and far more unsettling. As the wind howled outside their tents and the stars shone coldly overhead, Julia lay awake, her mind filled with images of the monks and the mysterious destination that seemed to lie ahead. The climb was only going to get harder from here, and something told her the mountain wasn't done testing them yet. The first light of dawn broke over the mountains, casting a pale glow across the snow-covered peaks. The team stirred from their restless sleep, their breath visible in the frigid air as they emerged from their tents. The previous night had been quiet, with only the wind as their constant companion. But there was an unspoken tension among them, a lingering unease from the day before, when the monks had appeared again, walking silently along the mountain. Mark was the first to rise, already busy checking gear and making sure everyone was prepared for the day ahead. The climb was about to get more dangerous, with steeper slopes and thinner air. They were entering the higher altitudes now, where the mountain's true dangers lay hidden in its icy embrace. "We need to move early," Mark said, his voice gruff but steady. "The weather's unpredictable up here, and we've got a long way to go before the next camp." The team nodded in agreement, though the fatigue of the climb was already starting to weigh heavily on their bodies. Julia strapped on her gear, her muscles aching from the previous day's ascent. She had barely slept, her mind restless with thoughts of the monks and the strange feeling that they were being watched. The mountain seemed different today, quieter, more ominous. "Everyone ready?" Sam asked, his usual lightheartedness absent this morning. There was no room for jokes now. Julia nodded, pulling her hood tighter around her face to block the biting cold. The wind had picked up again, swirling snowflakes around them as they prepared to set out. As they started the climb, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the mountain slopes. The landscape, vast and beautiful, felt unforgiving. Hours passed as the team ascended, each step harder than the last. The higher they climbed, the more the thin air clawed at their lungs. Every breath was an effort, and every movement felt like it took twice the energy. But despite the growing exhaustion, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The monks, they were still out there. She hadn't seen them since the night before, but the memory of their strange, steady march haunted her. Where were they going? And why did she feel like they were somehow connected to this climb? As if in response to her thoughts, the wind suddenly changed. It howled, picking up speed and sending flurries of snow whipping through the air. Mark stopped, holding up his hand as a signal to the others. "Everyone stop!" he yelled over the wind. The team halted, gripping their ropes and ice axes as the wind intensified. Dark clouds began to roll in from the horizon, moving fast, too fast. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't normal. They had checked the weather reports before starting the day's climb. There hadn't been any signs of a storm. But now, the sky above them was rapidly darkening, the clouds swirling like a living thing. A sense of dread gripped Julia's stomach. This was no ordinary storm. "We need to find shelter," Mark shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Now!" The climbers scrambled to secure their footing as the wind tore at them, pushing them dangerously close to the edge of the ridge. Snow whipped across their faces, blinding them, and the once clear path ahead was quickly becoming obscured by a wall of white. Sam, who had been just ahead of Julia, stumbled, nearly losing his balance. "I can't see a thing," he yelled, panic creeping into his voice. "Stay together," Mark shouted. "Stay on the ropes." The storm hit them with full force. Snow lashed at their faces, the wind howling like a living creature, furious and wild. The visibility dropped to almost nothing, the world around them consumed by a blinding white haze. The cold was unbearable, seeping into their bones despite their heavy gear. Julia gripped the rope connecting her to the others, her knuckles white under her gloves. Her mind raced. They had faced tough conditions before, but this was different. The storm had come out of nowhere, as if the mountain itself had summoned it to test their resolve. And it wasn't letting up. Minutes felt like hours as the team struggled against the brutal force of the storm. Mark led them forward, though it was nearly impossible to see where they were going. They needed shelter, anything to protect them from the raging wind. But the terrain was steep and exposed, offering no refuge. "Mark, we're not going to make it at this rate," Ben called out, his voice raw from the cold. Mark didn't respond. He kept moving, his focus on keeping the team together, but even he knew they were in serious danger. If they didn't find shelter soon, the storm would consume them. Julia's mind raced with fear. Her body was numb, and her vision was blurred by the snow whipping past her face. She couldn't hear anything beyond the roar of the wind and the pounding of her own heart. She glanced behind her, trying to make out the others through the blizzard, but they were barely visible, shadows in the storm. Then something moved in the distance. Through the wall of snow, Julia saw them, dark shapes moving steadily toward them. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks, the exhaustion and cold distorting her vision. But no, the figures were real, and they were coming closer. "The monks?" Julia whispered, though the words were lost to the wind. The others hadn't noticed yet, too focused on battling the storm. But Julia couldn't take her eyes off the approaching figures. It was the monks. The same monks they had seen days before, walking barefoot through the snow, unaffected by the cold. They moved with the same eerie grace, their robes flapping in the wind, but their steps calm, measured. How? Julia's voice trembled. How could they be here, in the middle of this deadly storm, walking as if nothing was wrong? And then the chanting started. Faint at first, almost drowned out by the howling wind, but unmistakable. The monks were chanting again, their voices low and rhythmic, blending with the storm itself. The others noticed them now. Mark stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No way," he muttered. The monks moved closer, their faces obscured by their hoods, their chanting growing louder. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She felt a strange pull, a compulsion to follow them, as if their presence offered something: protection, maybe, or salvation. "They're leading us somewhere," Ben said, his voice shaky. "We should follow." Mark hesitated, torn between his instinct as a leader and the inexplicable feeling that the monks were not a threat. Julia stepped forward, her mind made up. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "They're the only ones who know how to survive this." Mark gave a sharp nod, and with that, the team moved toward the monks, following their lead through the storm. The monks led them down a narrow path, their steps sure and unwavering, even as the snow continued to batter the team. The chanting grew louder, though the words remained incomprehensible, like a hymn from another world. The storm raged around them, but as they followed the monks, the wind seemed to lessen. Julia's fear began to ease, replaced by a strange sense of calm. The monks moved with purpose, as if they had always known this path. After what felt like hours, the monks led them to the mouth of a hidden cave, its entrance obscured by a jagged rock formation. It was shelter they never would have found on their own. The team scrambled inside, collapsing onto the cold stone floor, their bodies shaking from exhaustion and cold. The wind howled outside, but inside the cave, it was quiet, almost peaceful. Julia looked around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The monks were gone. They had led them to safety, and then vanished into the storm. The team huddled together, grateful to be alive, but shaken by what had just happened. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cave, they were safe. For now. As Julia sat there, catching her breath, she couldn't shake the feeling that the monks hadn't just saved them. They were leading them somewhere far beyond the storm. The storm outside raged on through the night, the howling winds a constant reminder of the peril they had narrowly escaped. Inside the cave, the climbers huddled together, trying to absorb what had just happened. The bitter cold clung to their bones, but at least they were alive. Julia sat with her back against the cave wall, her breath finally steadying after the adrenaline rush of their rescue. No one spoke for a long time, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. The fire they had managed to start flickered weakly, casting shadows on the stone walls around them. Outside, the storm roared like a beast, furious that its prey had slipped through its grasp. Sam was the first to break the silence, his voice low and filled with disbelief. "Those monks? They saved us." He glanced around at the others, his face pale and exhausted. How did they know where to take us? No one answered right away. Julia could see the confusion and fear on everyone's faces, the same mix of emotions that churned inside her. It didn't make sense. The monks had appeared out of nowhere, just when they were on the verge of being swallowed by the storm. How could they have known? "It's like they knew this storm was coming," Ben added, shaking his head. "Like they've been here before." Mark sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the mouth of the cave. He was the most experienced of them all, but even he seemed unsettled. His jaw was tight, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice grim. "I've seen strange things on this mountain, but nothing like that. No one survives a storm like this without gear, without protection." Julia shivered, though it wasn't just from the cold. The monks had appeared at the exact moment they needed help, walking through the storm as if it were nothing. And then, just as mysteriously, they had vanished after leading them to safety. "They've got to be from somewhere close by," Sam said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe there's a village or something we don't know about." George, who had been silent up until now, spoke softly from the edge of the group. "There is no village. Not here. No one lives in these parts. Not for many years. Julia looked over at Dorj, her heart sinking. If there was no village, no nearby civilization, then where had the monks come from? And where had they gone? Dorj's eyes were dark, filled with a kind of understanding that made Julia uneasy. He seemed to know more than he was saying. The monks, he said slowly, are not like us. They do not live by the same rules. What does that mean? Sam asked, frowning. They're just monks, right? Dorj shook his head. Not just monks. They are keepers. They protect something hidden, something sacred. The mountain allows them to walk its paths, to survive where others cannot. They are chosen. Julia's skin prickled at Dorj's words. Chosen. That word again. The idea of the monks being something more than human, something tied to the mountain itself, felt both unbelievable and inescapable. She had seen them with her own eyes, felt the strange calm they brought with them even as the storm raged around them. There was something about them, something ancient, otherworldly. Mark stood up, his face grim. We need to rest, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. Whatever those monks are, they got us through the storm. We're alive. That's what matters. We'll figure out the rest in the morning. The others nodded in agreement, though the unease still lingered. One by one, they settled down, their bodies exhausted from the climb and the storm. But even as Julia lay down, wrapping herself in her sleeping bag for warmth, sleep didn't come easily. Her mind was racing with questions, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. Hours passed, and at some point Julia's body gave in to exhaustion. Her dreams were restless, filled with images of the monks, their faces hidden beneath their hoods, their chants echoing in her mind. She saw them walking again, always ahead, always just out of reach. And in the distance, something loomed. Something she couldn't quite see, but could feel. She awoke with a start, her breath ragged. The cave was still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The storm outside had quieted, its fury spent, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Julia sat up, her heart pounding, and looked around. The others were still asleep, huddled together for warmth. But something was wrong. The air felt different, thicker, somehow. She couldn't explain it, but the sense of unease from the night before had returned, stronger now. And then she heard it, the chanting. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It was the same rhythmic chant the monks had been reciting when they found them in the storm. But now it was coming from deeper within the cave. Julia's pulse quickened. She glanced over at the others, but they were still asleep, unaware of the sound. Slowly, she got to her feet, moving quietly toward the back of the cave. The chanting grew louder as she walked, drawing her in like a siren's call. The deeper she went, the darker it became. Her flashlight flickered on, casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the confined space, but the chanting never faltered, its steady rhythm pulling her forward. At the far end of the cave, she found an opening, a narrow passage that seemed to lead even deeper into the mountain. The chanting was louder here, reverberating off the walls. Julia hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to wake the others. But something in the sound, something in the very air around her, compelled her to move forward. As she squeezed through the narrow passage, the air grew colder, sharper. The chanting was all around her now, enveloping her like a heavy fog. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Julia froze. The silence was deafening. Ahead, the passage opened into a larger chamber, its walls glistening with ice. In the center of the chamber, a strange object lay half buried in the snow. A small, intricately carved stone altar. Symbols she couldn't understand were etched into its surface, glowing faintly in the darkness. And standing around the altar, their heads bowed in silent prayer, were the monks. Julia's breath caught in her throat. They hadn't heard her, hadn't seen her approach. But there they were, motionless, as if waiting for something. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out of here. She had to wake the others. But as she turned to leave, one of the monks lifted his head. His face was hidden beneath his hood, but Julia could feel his gaze on her, piercing through the shadows. And then, in a voice that sent a chill down her spine, he spoke, though the words were not in any language she had ever heard. Shangri-La awaits. Morning came with a strange stillness, the kind of calm that made the storm of the previous night feel like a distant memory. The sky outside the cave was clear, a sharp blue that contrasted with the blinding white of the snow-covered slopes. The storm had passed, but its impact remained etched in the minds of the climbers. Julia sat by the remnants of the fire, her mind still reeling from what she had seen in the depths of the cave. The monks, the altar, the cryptic words, they haunted her, lingering like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Had it been real? Or had exhaustion and the cold played tricks on her mind? She hadn't told the others yet, unsure of how to explain what had happened. Unsure if she even believed it herself. The team gathered around the cave's entrance, preparing to resume the climb. There was a sense of unease among them, though no one spoke of it openly. They had all felt the storm's unnatural power, and the memory of the monk's appearance was still fresh in their minds. Mark, as always, was focused, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. Weather's cleared up. "We move now while we have a window," he said, his voice commanding but tense. "Let's try to reach the next camp before nightfall." The climbers nodded, though their usual energy was dampened. Julia noticed the way Sam kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see the monks again. Ben, usually the first to crack a joke, was silent, his face drawn with fatigue. As they set out, the ascent was grueling. The path was narrow, with sheer drops on either side, and the snow had become deep and treacherous after the storm. Every step was a battle against the thin air and the biting cold, and each of them felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on their spirits. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the crunch of snow beneath their boots. The higher they climbed, the more the landscape changed, becoming wilder, more alien. The towering peaks surrounded them like frozen giants, and the horizon seemed to stretch on forever, the world below fading into a distant memory. As the day wore on, the team began to sense something strange. The air was still freezing, but there was a warmth in it. Subtle at first, but unmistakable. The wind, which had been relentless for days, began to die down, leaving a strange, peaceful calm in its place. "What is this?" Sam muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. It's getting warmer." Julia felt it too. The biting chill that had defined the climb was lifting, replaced by something softer, almost welcoming. She looked around at the others, who were equally confused. "It doesn't make any sense," Ben said, his voice laced with suspicion. "We're going higher, but it feels like we're descending into a valley." Mark, always practical, frowned. "Could be a change in weather patterns, but stay focused. We're not out of danger yet." They pushed forward, but as they climbed, the warmth grew more pronounced. The snow beneath their boots became softer, and in some places it began to melt, revealing patches of grass, a sight that shouldn't have been possible at such an altitude. Then, as they rounded a bend in the path, the landscape shifted dramatically. Before them lay a hidden valley, unlike anything they had ever seen. Lush, green grass spread out beneath their feet, dotted with vibrant wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. A river, clear and sparkling, wound through the valley, its water glistening in the sunlight. The air was warm and sweet, filled with the scent of blossoms. Above, the sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by the harshness of the cold they had just escaped. For a moment, none of them could speak. They stood at the edge of the valley, their eyes wide with disbelief, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. This can't be real," Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. But it was real. The valley stretched out before them, untouched by the freezing cold and the brutal winds of Everest. It was a paradise, a hidden world nestled within the heart of the mountain. It was as if they had stepped into a dream. "Shangri-La," Dorj said softly, his voice filled with reverence. "We have found it." The name hung in the air like a prayer, and the climbers exchanged uncertain glances. Could this really be Shangri-La, the mythical paradise they had heard whispers of throughout their journey? It seemed impossible, yet here it was, right before their eyes. Mark, always the skeptic, shook his head. "This doesn't make sense. There's no way this place exists. Not here, not at this altitude." But the evidence was undeniable. The warmth, the lush greenery, the river. It was all here, defying the laws of nature and everything they had known about the mountain. As they descended into the valley, their weariness seemed to melt away. The aches and pains of the climb, the exhaustion that had weighed them down for days, vanished. It was as if the valley itself was healing them, replenishing their strength with every step. The monks were waiting for them. At the far end of the valley, near a cluster of ancient stone structures, the monks stood in silence. Their robes billowed gently in the breeze, and their faces remained hidden beneath their hoods. They did not speak, but their presence was unmistakable. A silent invitation. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. The sight of the monks brought back the memory of the night before, the altar deep within the cave, and the cryptic words, "Shangri-La awaits." The climbers hesitated, unsure of what to do. The monks had saved them, led them to this place. But why? What did they want? "Should we approach them?" Sam asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Mark frowned, his instincts as a leader battling with the strange reality of the situation. "I don't like this. We don't know who they are or what they want from us." But Dorj stepped forward, his expression calm, almost serene. "They have brought us here for a reason. We must trust them." With that, Dorj began walking toward the monks, and after a moment of hesitation, the others followed. As they approached, the monks remained still, their heads bowed in silent prayer. The valley seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When they were only a few feet away, one of the monks lifted his head. His face was still hidden beneath his hood, but Julia felt his gaze on her, as if he were looking directly into her soul. Without a word, the monk gestured toward the stone structures behind him. They were ancient, covered in moss and vines, but there was a beauty to them, an elegance that spoke of a time long past. "This is Shangri-La," Dorj whispered, awe in his voice. "The place we have been searching for." The monks stepped aside, allowing the climbers to pass. Julia's heart raced as they walked through the stone archway and entered the heart of Shangri-La. Inside, the world felt different, timeless, serene. The air was warm and fragrant, the sunlight soft and golden. Everything about this place felt otherworldly, as if they had crossed into another realm. But even as they stood in awe of the beauty around them, a sense of unease crept in. This place, this paradise, was perfect, too perfect. And Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just been brought here by chance. Shangri-La had its secrets, and they were about to uncover them. The valley of Shangri-La seemed to cradle the climbers in a comforting warmth, its beauty overwhelming in its perfection. Days had passed since they had first stepped through the stone archway, but the sense of disbelief had not left them. The lush grass, the crystal-clear river, the vibrant flowers, all of it felt like a dream too good to be true. The team had settled into a small stone structure, one of many scattered throughout the valley. The monks, ever silent, had shown them to the building, but offered no explanation, no guidance. It was as though they were meant to discover the secrets of Shangri-La on their own. Julia stood by the river, staring at her reflection in the still water. Her mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. The aches and pains of the climb were gone. Her exhaustion lifted the moment they had entered the valley. Her body felt stronger, more alive than it had in days. Yet, beneath the surface, something gnawed at her. A growing sense of unease. This place was too perfect, too serene. It felt unnatural. "What are you thinking about?" Sam's voice broke through her thoughts. He joined her by the river, his face a mixture of wonder and confusion. "You've been quiet since we got here." Julia hesitated, unsure how to put her feelings into words. "I don't know. Something about this place. It doesn't feel right." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't feel right? We just survived a storm that should have killed us, and now we're in paradise. What's not to like?" "I don't know," Julia said, her eyes drifting toward the distant mountains that surrounded the valley. "It just seems too perfect, like it's hiding something." Sam chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Come on, Julia. It's Shangri-La. Maybe we should just enjoy it while we can." But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The monks, the mysterious silence, the way the valley seemed to defy the natural laws of the mountain. It all pointed to something deeper, something hidden. And the more time they spent in Shangri-La, the stronger that feeling grew. Back at the stone structure, the rest of the team had gathered around a small fire, though the warmth seemed unnecessary in the temperate climate of the valley. Mark sat in silence, his face as unreadable as ever, while Ben and George spoke in low voices. "This place is a miracle," Ben said, his voice filled with awe. "I've never felt better in my life. No pain, no fatigue. It's like we're in another world." George nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Shangri-La has always been spoken of as a place beyond our world. A place where time moves differently, where the body heals and the spirit is renewed. But for how long?" Julia asked, stepping into the conversation. "How long can we stay here before something happens?" Ben frowned. "What do you mean?" Julia glanced around at the others, feeling the weight of their attention. "Doesn't it strike you as strange? The monks brought us here, but they haven't said a word. They're always watching, always close by, but they don't tell us anything. And this place, it's perfect. Too perfect. We don't know what's keeping it this way." Sam, who had followed Julia back to the group, sighed. "You're overthinking it, Julia. Maybe they're just being generous. Maybe this really is paradise." Mark, who had been silent for most of the discussion, finally spoke. "Nothing's ever free, especially not in a place like this." The group fell into a tense silence. Mark's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. Even George, who had been the first to speak of Shangri-La with reverence, looked troubled. "What do you think is happening?" Julia asked, turning to Mark. Mark stared into the fire, his eyes dark. "I've seen things like this before, in places that seem too good to be true. The locals offer you comfort, shelter, but there's always a price." Ben scoffed. "A price? We're still alive because of this place. You think they're just going to take it away?" Mark looked up, his expression hard. "I think we don't know anything about this place, or these monks. And that's what scares me." Julia felt a chill despite the warmth of the valley. She had been thinking the same thing. What was Shangri-La hiding? What was the cost of their salvation? As the group fell into an uneasy silence, a sudden movement caught Julia's eye. One of the monks had appeared at the edge of their camp, standing motionless like a statue. His face, as always, was hidden beneath the hood of his robe, but Julia could feel his gaze on them. "Look," she whispered, drawing the others' attention. The monk stood still for a moment longer, then gestured for them to follow. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though every step carried a weight they couldn't understand. Without a word, George rose to his feet. "We should go," he said quietly. "They are showing us something." Mark, Sam, and Ben exchanged uncertain glances, but eventually they stood and followed George. Julia's heart raced as she joined them, her stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and anticipation. What were the monks about to reveal? The monk led them deeper into the valley, away from the stone structures and the lush greenery. The landscape began to change, becoming wilder, more overgrown. The vibrant flowers gave way to thick vines, and the grass became sparse and dry. The air grew colder, though the sun still shone overhead. After what felt like hours of walking, the monks stopped at the entrance of a narrow cave. It was carved into the side of the mountain, its entrance dark and foreboding. Without a word, the monk gestured for them to enter. "Are you sure about this?" Sam whispered, his voice filled with doubt. "We came this far," Julia said, her resolve hardening. "We need to know." One by one, they entered the cave, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air inside was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols, similar to the ones Julia had seen on the altar deep within the cave that night. Her heart pounded as she realized they were stepping into something far more ancient, far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The passageway led them deeper underground, the light from their flashlights flickering against the strange carvings. The chanting returned, faint and distant, echoing through the narrow tunnel. At the end of the passage, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. In the center of the chamber stood a large stone altar, identical to the one Julia had seen before. Surrounding it were more monks, their heads bowed in silent prayer. But something was different this time. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, and the glow from the altar was stronger, pulsating with an otherworldly light. "What is this place?" Ben whispered, his voice filled with awe. Before anyone could answer, the monk who had led them here stepped forward. He reached out and placed his hands on the altar, and in that moment, the light from the symbols flared, filling the chamber with a blinding brilliance. Julia shielded her eyes, her heart racing. The light was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very air was alive with energy. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she heard the monk's voice. "Shangri-La must be sustained." The words echoed in her mind, and in that instant, Julia understood. The valley, the paradise they had entered, it was not eternal. It was fragile, delicate, held together by the ancient magic of the monks and the sacrifices they made. Shangri-La had a price, and they were standing at the heart of it. The light dimmed, and Julia lowered her hands, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The monks remained motionless, their heads still bowed, but the message was clear. Shangri-La was not just a paradise. It was a prison, sustained by forces they could not comprehend. And now, they were a part of it. The once soothing warmth of Shangri-La had become a heavy blanket of unease. The climbers had been in the valley for days, but the initial awe of its beauty was beginning to fade, replaced by creeping suspicion. The lush grass and vibrant flowers still surrounded them, but the tranquility now felt like a veil hiding something much darker. Mark sat near the entrance of their stone shelter, sharpening his knife in tense silence. The team was beginning to fracture, each member wrestling with the strange calm that had settled over them since arriving in Shangri-La. Julia paced nearby, unable to shake the growing feeling that they were being watched, even though the monks were nowhere to be seen. "We need to leave," she muttered, breaking the silence. "There's something wrong with this place." Ben, who had been lounging against a nearby wall, scoffed. "Are you serious?" "We're in a literal paradise, Julia. What could possibly be wrong with it?" Julia shot him a glare. "Exactly. It's too perfect. Nothing about this place makes sense. We don't even know how we got here. And the monks saved our lives," Ben interrupted, frustration flashing in his eyes. "If it weren't for them, we'd be dead in that storm." "That doesn't mean we're safe now," Mark said, his voice low and steady. He looked up from his knife, his expression grim. "Nothing comes without a price, Ben, and we don't know what the price is yet." Ben opened his mouth to argue, but the words seemed to die in his throat. He looked out at the valley, his face twisted in confusion. "I don't get it. You all sound like you're expecting some kind of punishment. This place is a miracle. Why can't we just stay?" "Because it doesn't feel right," Sam said quietly from the back of the shelter. His usually light-hearted demeanor had darkened over the past few days, his smiles replaced by uneasy glances at the monks who roamed the valley in silence. "There's something off about all of this. It feels like we're trapped." George, who had been sitting in quiet contemplation, finally spoke. "Shangri-La is not meant for outsiders. It is a place of balance, but balance requires sacrifice." The word hung in the air, sending a chill down Julia's spine. "Sacrifice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" George's expression was grave. "The valley's beauty, its perfection, it is not natural. The monks have lived here for centuries, protecting it, but nothing remains perfect without cost. I have heard stories from my people, stories of those who were brought here and never returned." Julia's stomach churned. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. "So what?" Ben said, his voice rising. "We're supposed to believe we were brought here to keep the valley alive?" George nodded solemnly. "Shangri-La must be sustained. The monks live here, but they cannot leave. Those who are brought here, their presence is required to keep the balance. Without it, the valley will fade." Mark stood, his hands gripping the knife tightly. "And how do we leave then? How do we get out before that happens?" George looked down, his face heavy with regret. "Once you enter Shangri-La, you cannot simply leave. The mountain will not let you go without consequence." Julia's heart pounded in her chest. They were trapped, just as she had feared. "What happens if we try?" she asked. George looked up, meeting her gaze with somber eyes. "The mountain will decide." A cold silence fell over the group. The gravity of their situation was undeniable now. They were part of something ancient, something beyond their control. "We have to try," Julia said, her voice firm. "We can't just stay here and become whatever this place wants us to be." Mark nodded, standing beside her. "We need to prepare. We don't know what's waiting for us if we try to leave, but we can't stay here and wait to find out." Ben stood too, though he seemed less sure. "And what if we don't make it? What if leaving kills us?" Julia looked at him, her resolve unwavering. "I'd rather take my chances out there than stay here and become part of this lie." Reluctantly, the rest of the team agreed. They spent the rest of the day quietly preparing, gathering supplies, and trying to plan their escape. The warmth of the valley, once so comforting, now felt oppressive. The vibrant flowers and clear waters seemed to mock their growing fear. As night fell, the monks reappeared, standing at a distance like silent sentinels. Their presence was unnerving, their stillness more threatening than any storm. Julia's heart raced as she watched them, knowing that they were watching in return. "They know we're planning to leave," Sam whispered, his voice tense. "They're not going to let us go." Julia clenched her fists, determination flooding her. "We'll make it. We have to." The next morning, the team set out, their packs heavy with supplies, their hearts heavier with fear. The monks did not follow them, but their presence was palpable, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that held the valley together. The path out of Shangri-La was steep and treacherous, and as they climbed, the warmth of the valley began to fade. The air grew thinner, colder, biting at their exposed skin. It was as though they were being pushed back, the mountain itself resisting their departure. Julia's breath came in ragged gasps as she climbed higher, her legs burning with the effort. Behind her, Sam stumbled, nearly slipping on the icy rocks. "We're almost there," Mark called, his voice strained. "Just keep moving." But as they neared the edge of the valley, the ground began to tremble beneath their feet. Julia's heart leapt in her chest as a low, rumbling sound filled the air. The mountain was waking up. "We have to move faster," Mark shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing roar. The path ahead began to crumble, rocks tumbling down the mountainside as the tremors grew stronger. The air was filled with the deafening sound of the earth shifting, as if the mountain itself was trying to swallow them whole. Julia pushed forward, her heart pounding in her ears. The entrance to the valley was just ahead, but the ground was shaking violently, threatening to collapse beneath their feet. As they reached the final stretch, a massive crack split the ground in front of them, cutting off their path. "No!" Sam shouted, his face pale with fear. Julia's mind raced as she looked for another way out. The valley was closing in around them, the perfect paradise revealing its true, deadly nature. "This way," Mark shouted, gesturing toward a narrow ledge that led around the crack. One by one, they made their way across the ledge, their hands gripping the rocks as the mountain trembled beneath them. Julia's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she edged along the cliffside, the drop below her too terrifying to think about. Just as they reached the other side, the ground gave one final violent shudder, and with a deafening crash, the entrance to the valley collapsed in a cloud of dust and stone. They were free. Panting and exhausted, the team stood on the other side, staring back at the ruined entrance to Shangri-La. The monks were nowhere to be seen, and the valley, once so vibrant and alive, was now hidden behind a wall of destruction. Julia's legs trembled as she sank to the ground, her heart pounding with relief. They had made it. They had escaped. But as she looked at the collapsed entrance, a nagging thought tugged at the back of her mind. What had they left behind? And what had Shangri-La truly been? The climbers stood at the edge of the collapsed entrance to Shangri-La, their hearts pounding, their bodies trembling from both exhaustion and the shock of their escape. The once perfect, pristine valley was now nothing but a memory, buried beneath a mountain of rock and dust. The monks had vanished, but their presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the unspoken forces that had held them captive in that unnatural paradise. Julia was the first to break the silence. She stood, clutching her pack tightly, her eyes fixed on the distant peaks that marked the way back to the outside world. But even as she looked toward the horizon, her mind was still trapped in the valley, haunted by the monks' cryptic words and the unsettling serenity that had masked a dark secret. "We can't stay here," Mark said, his voice hoarse. He, too, was staring out at the mountains, though his expression was hard to read. "We need to keep moving." Sam wiped a sweat from his brow, his face pale from the strain of the climb. "Are we sure we're safe?" His voice cracked as he spoke, fear creeping into every word. "What if they follow us?" Julia's heart skipped a beat at the thought. She hadn't allowed herself to consider that possibility. The monks had let them leave, but had they really? She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see their dark, robed figures standing at the edge of the collapsed path. But there was nothing. Only the wind howling through the jagged rocks. "We'll keep moving," Mark said firmly. "If we stop, the mountain will take us. We've already pushed our luck once." Without another word, the team set off, their pace quick and determined. The air grew colder as they descended the mountain, and the familiar bite of Everest's unforgiving climate returned. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, but Julia welcomed the challenge. It was real, solid, unlike the eerie stillness of Shangri-La. But even as they climbed, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The monks might not be following them, but the mountain was alive with a different energy now. It felt like it was waiting, testing their resolve. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of their boots crunching through the snow and the occasional gust of wind that sent a shiver through Julia's bones. The tension among the group was palpable, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their minds still trying to process everything that had happened. As they rounded a sharp bend in the path, Julia's foot slipped on a patch of ice. She gasped, flailing as she tried to regain her balance. Mark was there in an instant, grabbing her arm and steadying her before she could fall. "Careful," he muttered, his grip firm. "The path gets more dangerous from here." Julia nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The near fall had shaken her, but what scared her more was the way the ground had felt beneath her feet. Unstable, like the mountain itself, was shifting. The thought gnawed at her as they continued their descent. The path, once clear and reliable, now seemed treacherous. Rocks crumbled underfoot, and patches of ice appeared in places where there should have been none. It was as if the mountain was conspiring against them, trying to push them back toward Shangri-La. "We need to find shelter," Sam said suddenly, his voice breaking through the tension. He glanced at the sky, where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "There's another storm coming." Julia's stomach clenched. The last storm had nearly killed them, and she wasn't sure they could survive another. But the look on Mark's face was grim. He knew they had no choice. "We keep moving," he said, though his tone was less confident than before. "We'll find somewhere to hunker down. Just keep your eyes open." The wind picked up as they pressed on, howling through the narrow crevices of the mountain. The temperature plummeted, and snow began to fall. Light at first, but quickly growing thicker, more relentless. The visibility dropped, and soon they were engulfed in a whiteout, the world around them disappearing into a swirling mass of snow and ice. Julia's pulse quickened as the storm closed in around them. The memory of the last storm, the one that had led them into Shangri-La, flashed through her mind. The same helplessness, the same terror clawed at her now. But this time, there were no monks to save them, no mysterious valley waiting to shelter them from the storm. The team huddled close together, moving as one through the blinding snow. Julia's muscles ached from the cold, and every breath felt like fire in her lungs. Her heart pounded as the wind howled louder, as if the mountain itself was roaring in fury. The storm was getting worse, and they were running out of time. "I can't see anything," Ben shouted over the wind, his voice filled with panic. Mark cursed under his breath. "We need to stop. We'll freeze to death if we keep going like this." The words hung heavy in the air. They had no good options. If they stopped, they risked being buried by the storm. If they kept moving, they could slip, fall, or worse, be swallowed by the mountain. Suddenly, a sound cut through the storm. Faint, almost impossible to hear over the wind, but unmistakable. Chanting ... Julia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Mark, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Mark's eyes widened as he listened. The chanting grew louder, carried on the wind like a whisper from the valley they had just escaped. "No," Sam muttered, his face ashen. No. The sound was unmistakable now. It was the same rhythmic chant the monks had spoken in Shangri-La, the same haunting melody that had followed them through the storm before. "They're coming," Julia whispered, her voice shaking. Mark's jaw tightened. "We move. Now." Panic surged through the group as they pushed forward, but the storm fought them at every turn. The snow fell harder, the wind howling like a beast, and the chanting followed them, growing louder, closer. "We're not going to make it," Ben cried, his voice cracking with fear. "Keep moving," Mark barked, though even he sounded terrified. The mountain rumbled beneath their feet, the earth shifting as if it too was responding to the monk's chant. Julia's heart raced as the ground trembled, the path ahead cracking and crumbling with each step. Then, without warning, the snow beneath Sam gave way. He let out a cry as the ground collapsed beneath him, sending him tumbling down the mountainside. "Sam!" Julia screamed, rushing to the edge. But he was gone, swallowed by the storm. "No!" Ben cried, stumbling backward, his face twisted in horror. "This can't be happening. They're taking us." Julia's mind raced, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The mountain was collapsing around them, the storm ripping apart the world they had known, and the chanting. Oh God, the chanting. It was everywhere, inside her mind, pulling her back to Shangri-La. "We have to go," Mark shouted, grabbing her arm. "We can't stop." Julia tore her gaze away from the ledge, her heart aching with the loss of Sam. But there was no time to grieve. The mountain was falling apart, and the monks. They were coming for them. With every ounce of strength she had left, Julia pushed forward, her body numb, her mind focused only on survival. The storm raged on, relentless, but through the chaos, she could feel the weight of Shangri-La pulling at her, calling her back. The monks' voices echoed in the wind, their chant growing louder, more insistent. The mountain trembled beneath their feet, the ground splitting and cracking, as if the very earth was fighting to keep them from escaping. And then, through the blinding snow, Julia saw it. A cave, barely visible through the storm. Without thinking, she pointed. "There! Shelter!" Mark and Ben didn't hesitate. They stumbled toward the cave, half blind from the snow and the wind, but driven by the primal instinct to survive. As they reached the mouth of the cave, the chanting suddenly stopped. The storm continued to rage outside, but the silence that followed the monks' voices was deafening. Julia collapsed inside the cave, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. Mark and Ben slumped down beside her, their faces pale, their breaths ragged. They were alive, but barely. Julia's heart raced as she glanced back at the storm, her mind still reeling from the horrors they had just escaped. The monks, their chant, Shangri-La, it wasn't over. She knew that now. "Are we safe?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He simply stared out into the storm, his face grim. Julia's hands shook as she gripped her knees, her thoughts racing. The monks hadn't just let them go. They had followed them. And now, as the storm raged on, Julia couldn't help but wonder, had they truly escaped Shangri-La? Or had they only delayed the inevitable? The storm had swallowed the world in a furious whirl of snow and wind. Julia could barely see beyond her outstretched hand, her lungs burning with the cold. But she pushed forward, desperate. Every step felt like an eternity, every breath a struggle. Mark was just ahead, fighting the elements with grim determination, but even he couldn't hide the exhaustion weighing him down. Behind them, the monks' chanting filled the air, louder and more insistent with every passing moment. It wasn't just an echo of their voices. It felt as if the mountain itself was speaking through them, the low hum of ancient power resonating deep within the earth. Julia felt it in her bones, a pull toward the heart of Shangri-La, as if the valley wasn't finished with them yet. The promise of eternal peace, of rest, whispered at the edge of her mind, tempting her to stop, to turn back. But she couldn't stop. Not now. "We're almost there," Mark shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the howling wind. Julia gritted her teeth, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to give in to the bone-deep weariness creeping over her. She wouldn't let the mountain take her. She wouldn't let the monks win. But then, the ground beneath her shifted. Julia stumbled, her boots slipping on a patch of ice, and for a terrifying moment, she felt herself falling. Her hands flailed, reaching for anything solid, and then Mark's hand was there, gripping her wrist and yanking her back to her feet. "Stay with me," he shouted, his voice rough and desperate. Julia nodded, her heart pounding. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the dark-robed figures of the monks looming behind them. But the storm was too thick, too wild. There was nothing but swirling snow and the endless, deafening chant that seemed to be coming from the very mountain itself. "We can't outrun them forever," Julia yelled, her voice trembling. "They'll find us." Mark's jaw clenched, but he didn't reply. He knew it as well as she did. The monks weren't bound by the same rules of survival, and the mountain, this living, breathing entity, was on their side. They were fighting against forces they couldn't understand, forces far older and stronger than they could ever hope to be. But still, they had to try. The storm raged on as they made their way along the crumbling path. Every step felt like a battle. The wind tore at them, the cold biting deep into their bones, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and crack with every movement. It was as if the mountain was alive, trying to shake them off, to bury them under the snow. Then, through the blinding storm, Julia saw it. The path ahead, the way out. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Mark, there!" Mark followed her gaze, his eyes widening as he saw the narrow, rocky trail that led away from the mountain's deadly grasp. It wasn't far, maybe a few hundred meters. But between them and freedom, the ground was already breaking apart, splitting under the pressure of the mountain's fury. "We have to go," Mark shouted, grabbing Julia's arm and pulling her toward the path. They ran. They ran harder and faster than they had ever run before, their legs burning, their lungs aching, the storm whipping around them with savage intensity. The monks' chants grew louder, closer, as if they were just behind them, their voices weaving through the wind, urging the mountain to collapse, to trap the climbers forever within its icy tomb. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and cracks spidered out from the cliffs on either side. Rocks tumbled down, crashing into the snow with deafening thuds, and the earth itself seemed to groan, threatening to give way at any moment. Mark reached the edge of the path first, leaping across a small crevice that had opened up. He turned back, reaching for Julia. "Come on!" Julia's heart raced as she sprinted forward, her boots skidding on the ice as she reached the crevice. The gap was widening, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She leapt, her fingers brushing against Mark's hand. And then the ground collapsed. Julia screamed as the world fell away beneath her. She flailed, grasping at nothing, her body plummeting toward the jagged rocks below. But then, suddenly, impossibly, Mark's hand was there, gripping her wrist with iron strength. He pulled her back, her body slamming into the side of the cliff as she dangled above the abyss. "Hold on!" Mark grunted, his muscles straining as he hauled her up. Julia's heart raced as she clawed her way onto solid ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked up at Mark, his face pale and streaked with sweat, and nodded her thanks. But there was no time for words. The mountain wasn't done with them yet. They turned, ready to make the final push toward the exit. But then Julia froze. The monks were there. They stood at the edge of the crumbling path, their dark robes flapping in the wind, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. Their hands were raised, palms open toward the climbers, and their chants, low, rhythmic, powerful, vibrated through the air, through the earth. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The monk's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very mountain was speaking through them, commanding her to stop, to turn back. "Don't listen to them," Mark shouted, grabbing her arm. "We have to go." But Julia couldn't move. The chanting, it was inside her mind now, pulling at her thoughts, her memories, whispering promises of peace, of rest, of eternal safety. She saw Shangri-La again in her mind's eye. The valley's impossible beauty, the warmth, the serenity. No pain, no fear, no suffering. Just peace. "They're offering us a way out," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "If we go back—" "No!" Mark shouted, shaking her hard. "It's a lie, Julia. It's all a lie. They'll trap us there forever." Julia's head spun, her heart torn between the desperate need for survival and the overwhelming temptation of Shangri-La. Could she really outrun this? Could they ever truly escape the monks and the mountain's grasp? Or would they spend the rest of their lives running, fighting, suffering? "We don't belong there," Mark said, his voice steady, his grip firm. "We fight." With a final, desperate effort, Julia broke free of the monk's pull. She nodded, her heart pounding as she turned toward the exit. The ground shook violently beneath their feet, the rocks splitting apart, but they ran. They ran for their lives. The storm howled around them. The mountain groaned and trembled. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the path's end. They stumbled through the rocky pass, the monk's chants fading behind them, the mountain's fury losing its grip. They had escaped. But even as the storm cleared and the mountain fell silent, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced back, her heart racing. The entrance to Shangri-La was gone, buried beneath tons of rock and snow. The monks were nowhere to be seen, but the mountain was still there, and something told her it always would be. Mark collapsed onto the snow, his chest heaving, his face pale with exhaustion. Julia sank to her knees beside him, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. They had made it. They were alive. But as Julia stared up at the towering peak of Everest, her heart still racing, she knew that they hadn't truly escaped. The monks might be gone, Shangri-La might be buried, but the mountain, the force that had trapped them, was still alive, watching, waiting. "We made it," Mark gasped, his voice filled with disbelief. But Julia wasn't sure. She wasn't sure they had made it at all. The storm was gone. The chanting had stopped. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the mountain was holding its breath, waiting for them to take their next step. "Did we really escape?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. The answer was in the wind, in the rocks, in the snow. Shangri-La was gone. But the mountain would always be there. And somewhere, deep in the earth, the monks' chants would echo forever, waiting for the next travelers to fall into their grasp. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.